Hello, hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Responding to Trauma, the Role of K-12 Schools. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm Jennifer Spiegler, Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships here at Kognito, and I'll facilitate today's session. We're delighted to have you. We are going to scoot right into the presentation at the very top of the hour here because as we try to make the most of Dr. Wong's time today, she's headed to one of the many sites where she consults with communities affected by traumatic events, today to Northern California's fire-affected communities. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We are recording the call so you can access a copy in a follow-up email along with a copy of the presentation slides. Also, you're in listen-only mode, and we expect to have about 1,000 people on the line today from every corner of the country. So your lines are muted, but you are welcome to pose questions in the dialog box at the right side of your screen. And many of you sent in questions ahead of time, many of which will be answered throughout the presentation. So now, without further ado, please let me introduce Marlene Wong, who kicks off the panel. Dr. Wong holds many titles, including Senior Vice Dean and Clinical Professor of the University of Southern California's Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work. And because we're talking today about schools, I want to also note that she is formerly Director of Mental Health Services, Crisis Intervention, and Suicide Prevention for the Los Angeles Unified School District and former Director of School Crisis and Intervention at the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. Marlene, thank you so much for joining us. Here you go. Please start.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jennifer, and welcome to all of you who are on this call. Part of what's going to be presented today comes from the research partnership that Pamela and I have been engaged in for the last 20 years with Rand Health, with the UCLA partnered NIMH Research Center, as well as other departments such as the Department of Psychiatry and Pediatrics at the Geffen Medical School at UCLA. And now the home of this center is at the USC Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work. We're talking here today because trauma is the #1 public health issue of our time. And in many respects, it is also the civil rights issue of our time. Adults and now children are subjected to so much stress in their lives and to so much violence. In fact, it has been surmised that perhaps this generation of children has been exposed to more violence and conflict in their lives than any other previous generation of children. And we need not only public health policies, but also educational policies and evidence-based practices in schools to address the problems. Because some existing policies re-traumatize children, including some disciplinary actions that we take as part of our day-to-day way of handling situations. And science has taught us that there are ways in which the brains of children, the bodies of children, the reactions of children definitely are barriers when they have been exposed to violence in their homes and in their communities, that these changes create barriers to learning. Just briefly, our RAND USC UCLA research that was done in the Los Angeles Unified School District showed that in zip codes of high crime, poverty, gang conflicts, drug sales and use, as well as drug abuse, that 88 to 92% of the 11-year-olds in those zip codes had been exposed to some kind of community violence. Of those children, 27% of those 11-year-olds had diagnoses of PTSD, and an additional 16% of the children had childhood depression. The sad and tragic part of these statistics is that not one child was referred to a school psychologist, a school social worker, a school nurse, nor had they been identified as having PTSD or depression. And the reason for that is because PTSD and depression are invisible and are invisible often to the people who love them best, their parents, and the teachers and the people who interact with them every day. So let me start out with, excuse me, what is childhood trauma? And it's defined as a severe emotional response to a frightening or threatening or even a series of events that leave a person overwhelmed and unable to cope. And you can see here that it can be one event, or it can be multiple events that affect a child, or it can be cumulative or ongoing events. Children can be exposed to a variety of these kinds of experiences, including physical and emotional abuse and neglect. And next slide, please. So violence can happen in their homes, in the community, in their schools, or even online, where 24-hour access to the internet has caused and had in sort of unplanned consequences to how children can bring those experiences into the schools. Children also can lack the basic access to necessities like food, water, and clothing. And we can look at current events that provide so many examples of children who are suffering under severe stress. So while experiencing any one discrete negative event, such as physical abuse or witnessing a murder can cause trauma, children can also experience trauma through the cumulative effects of multiple ongoing events, such as experiencing homelessness, being removed repeatedly from one's parents' home, and moving from one foster family to another. And next slide, please. In a study that was done by Kaiser in 2007, the risk factors for childhood trauma are poverty, domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence, abuse and neglect, physical abuse and sexual abuse, family chaos and conflict that can come from arguments in the home and can be exacerbated by drug or alcohol use in the home. We have many children now who are homeless or have insecure housing where parents move from place to place in search of a job, in search of new beginnings, or especially if a family member is incarcerated. And next slide, please. Identifying at-risk students, I think that's something that educators know a lot about. As a member of the Teachers Union for over 20 years and the Administrators Union for an additional 15 years, we know that these children who have been affected by trauma, we've been dealing with them for many, many, many years throughout our careers. There are children who are chronically absent. There are students who are frequently expelled and suspended from schools. There are students in foster care, in special education. There are children in our classrooms who are hostile, angry, attacking, acting out. There are children who are depressed and withdrawn. And now more and more, there are children who are subjected to bullying. And next slide, please. What does it mean to be a trauma-informed school? I've modified the definition that was provided by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, part of the Department of Health and Human Services. A system such as a school or a district that is trauma-informed realizes how widespread the impact of trauma can be and thinks of new ways of improving the educational and behavioral outcomes for children through their mission of educating. Secondly, a trauma-informed system recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in children of others, or even asks the question, could this behavior be related to an experience with trauma or violence that the child has had? And sadly, it means that there may be faculty or staff and families in the community who also have been subjected to trauma and violence and have what we call trauma histories. In fact, in our research, when we developed our cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, in one of our first iterations of that intervention, 76% of the parents who really had no idea that their child had been traumatized and had PTSD, when they learned what the symptoms were, they said to us, there are other people in our family that have this same disorder. The third aspect of a trauma-informed school is that it integrates the knowledge that science has provided about trauma into teaching, into discipline policies, discipline procedures, and practices in schools of dealing with children who are withdrawn or acting out. And the last is that a trauma-informed school or district seeks to interact with children in a way that does not re-traumatize them, reject them, or just expel them out of the school system. With that, I truly believe that every one of you on this call today has a great deal to offer and can change. You can change the way in which children respond, and you can improve the way in which education and behavior is exhibited by children in your schools and communities. I'm going to turn this over now to Jennifer and my colleagues.
Thank you, Marlene, and safe travels. We're going today. Okay, so that sets you up pretty solidly to understand what your role is and what your role is in bringing forward trauma-informed approaches. So thank you so much, Marlene. Next, we're going to hear from Pamela Vona. Pamela works with Marlene at the University of Southern California's Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work as project specialist. She is also program manager for the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Trauma in Schools, and along with, and she will be telling us about some of that work today. And followed by Pam, we're going to hear from Janet Pasmantier from the MHA of Texas, and then we will take questions. So let me hand it over to Pamela. Thank you, Pamela, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to be here with all of you today. And we can launch into my first slide. And so, as has been mentioned, I am the program manager for Dr. Wong's NCTSA Center for Trauma in Schools. And today I'm going to be presenting and talking about our center's newly launched online school self-assessment for trauma responsiveness. And as a center, we really wanted to develop this tool because we recognize that there are so many different policy directives and national calls and local calls for schools to become trauma-informed systems, yet there's very little practical guidance out there for helping schools translate this now ubiquitous term, trauma-informed, into concrete programming on their campuses. Similarly, I know that almost on a daily basis, I'm fielding inquiries from school administrators and school counselors who are asking me explicitly, so what exactly do we need to do to become a trauma-informed school? And so from our vantage point as a center, we realized that schools and districts could really benefit from an easily accessible, user-friendly tool that could help them gauge their current level of trauma responsiveness, and a tool that could also, based on a school's strengths and weaknesses, provide tailored and actionable recommendations for enhancing trauma responsiveness moving forward. Next slide. But before we could develop the online tool itself, we really had to take a step back and define for ourselves more concretely what we considered to be the key components of a trauma-informed school. And to to do so, we wanted to be systematic, and we wanted to build on the literature as well as the great level of expertise that already exists in this field. So we utilized a modified version of the RAND UCLA appropriateness method, which is an evaluation methodology designed specifically to synthesize the scientific literature and expert opinion on a given healthcare-related topic. Next slide. And here's just a high-level overview of the process we engaged in order to identify these key components that could then be put into this online self-assessment. First, we conducted a thorough overview and review of the literature on trauma-informed schools. This review led us to develop an initial rubric, which contained what we thought might be the primary domains of a trauma-informed school and the indicators that fall within each of these domains. We then convened a panel of national experts and asked them to rate these domains. We reviewed their ratings, and where there was consensus for a domain and an indicator, we locked it into place as being important. And for items where consensus was not reached, we engaged our national experts in a dialogue in order to better understand discrepancies in opinion. And then based on this discussion, we revised domains and indicators. We added additional domains and indicators. And upon a second round of rating, we finalized our rubric. Next slide, please. And here I'll just provide a little bit of detail about the rating process. So again, you can understand how these key components have been identified. We provided our experts with an initial list of 7 domains and 32 indicators and asked them to rate all 39 items on 2 different scales. One of the scales was we were asking how important is this item to a school being trauma-informed? And then secondly, how actionable or feasible would this component be to implement in a school? So those 2 items were assessed in the rating process. And here are some of the outcomes that allowed us to finalize our rubric, which has informed the online self-assessment. And upon our first rating, we had an 85% consensus. 6 items required follow-up, and we were revised according to discussion. And we added an additional domain. And all of these items received consensus after the second round of review. So this left us with a rubric that is comprised of 8 domains and 36 indicators. So now I will just quickly step through these domains and indicators. And this figure, in next slide, sorry, it's the concentric circles, is a way of conceptualizing the domains. Here we can think of it as having different levels of support wrapping around our students. Next slide. But when we look at it from this other angle, we realize that these spheres of support are really not all that different from the tiers in a response to intervention framework or a multi-tiered system of support. And it's not surprising that our domains ended up reflecting a tiered approach. Again, we were using this appropriateness methodology that synthesized opinion in the field. And what we saw is that much of the literature and many of the best practices reflect this tiered approach. So now I'll just walk through the domains and some of the indicators that comprise those domains. Next slide. So starting from the top and the most intensive, the first key domain are targeted trauma supports for those students that we know are experiencing symptoms of traumatic stress. So examples of indicators within this domain would be whether a school as multidisciplinary team has a clearly defined approach for examining trauma exposure as a contributor to student performance. Does the school have a formalized working relationship with an external community mental health agency that has expertise in trauma. Next slide. Moving down, the next key domain is our early intervention approaches. And examples of indicators in this domain would include whether a school is routinely incorporating trauma exposure into the mental health assessment. Does the school have staff trained in and available to implement evidence-based early interventions for trauma? Examples of these interventions would be the cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, which is a group-based intervention for middle and high school students. Support for students exposed to trauma is also an intervention for middle school aged and high school aged students, but it is designed to be implemented by a non-clinician. And then finally, Bounce Back is a group-based intervention for elementary aged students. Next slide. And then classroom level strategies emerged as an important domain in this assessment, and I believe we'll be hearing more about those later in today's webinar. But here, these are really what we thought of as strategies that are designed to first enhance a sense of physical and emotional safety for students in the classroom, but also strategies to provide behavioral and academic accommodations to trauma-exposed students. Next slide. And we gleaned that there is a range of trauma programming that can be implemented at the whole school level. And I want to stress that it's very likely that schools are already engaging in a number of these programs or initiatives, but they may not realize that it is already part of a trauma-informed school. Indicators that fall within this domain would be whether a school has discipline policies that are sensitive to trauma-exposed students. Is the school utilizing restorative practices as part of its discipline? Are school staff trained to provide emotional support to students should a traumatic event occur on or near campus? Next slide. We also want to emphasize that preventing a traumatic event is a critical component of a trauma-informed school. And so prevention at the whole school level warranted its own domain. An example of indicators that would fall within this domain would include routine use of a school climate assessment. And we want to stress that this is a climate assessment that would be completed by all stakeholders at the school. Are staff trained in a strategy for reinforcing behavioral expectations on campus? Next slide. And we know that it's incredibly important for students to feel both physically and emotionally safe on campus in order for them to be able to learn. And so strategies to enhance safety on campus, things such as, does the school have adequate supervision? Are there clearly defined processes to determine when a student may represent harm to students or staff? Next slide. And here we talk a lot about whether students are ready to learn, but we also know that students aren't ready to learn if teachers aren't ready to teach. And so whole school staff support became a very important domain from our perspective. And things that fall within this domain would be, does a school have a clearly defined approach to building staff awareness and compassion about compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress? Do schools have on-campus resources for staff who are regularly working with trauma-exposed students? Next slide. And finally, from our perspective, a trauma-informed school rests upon strong communities and families And so here, we believe as part of a trauma-informed school, it's critical to have strategies to engage communities and families in a dialogue about trauma. It's critical for the school to have partnerships with trusted community organizations. So those are the domains and examples of the indicators that now are part of, and if you can go to the next slide, the Trauma Responsive School Implementation Assessment, which is available on the SHAPE system platform. And if you go to the next slide, here you will see an example of what the dashboard looks like for completing this online school self-assessment. You can see the different domains that I just discussed listed there. You can take the survey, and then you will have a report generated. Next slide. This is an example of what it would look like to step through one of the domain surveys. And then the next slide, we really felt like it wasn't enough just to give a numerical value for a score to give everyone a sense of how they're doing. We really wanted to provide as much as possible some tailored feedback about what a score means, and then depending upon how you scored, to also provide some recommendations for next steps to enhance your trauma programming within a particular domain. If you go to the next slide, there's just another example of the type of report that you would receive on the back end after completing the online school self-assessment. Next slide. And then lastly, I just wanted to leave you with some resources from our Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Resiliency, Hope, and Wellness in Schools. And so if you go to the final slide here, again, where we have these concentric circles, I want to share with you what types of resources that we can provide to you. And our center for 20 years has been devoted to the development of evidence-based trauma interventions designed specifically to be implemented in the school setting. So examples of these interventions that our center has developed are the cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, here in this innermost circle, support for students exposed to trauma, bounce back, and our newest intervention, LIFT, which is Life Improvement for Teens, is an online self-paced curriculum for stress and trauma for middle and high school age students. And then moving outward, resources to help build the knowledge and skills of non-clinical school staff. We have support for teachers affected by trauma, which is an online curriculum to help teachers who might be experiencing compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. We're also in the process of developing a trauma-informed policing in schools curriculum to support the trauma knowledge and skills of school resource officers. And then finally, we're developing our trauma-informed educator simulations, which will be an online interactive curriculum where teachers can learn more about trauma and how to more effectively engage with students with trauma histories. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and I will turn it over to the moderator.
Okay, thank you so much, Pamela. That was great. So we've got some really great guidance, nuts and bolts for those of you in the audience today who are really looking to implement trauma-informed practices in your schools. I want to go now directly to somebody who works with schools to introduce trauma-informed practices every single day, and that is Janet Pasmantier, Director of the Center for School Behavioral Health America of Greater Houston, a program that was born of Hurricane Katrina and where Janet is now coordinating the Hurricane Harvey response along with Dr. Wong and Dr. Julie Kaplow and others. Janet, thank you for being here today.
Jennifer, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this. And if you could advance to the first slide, I'll just go ahead and get started. Many of you may, when you think of Texas, you may think of cowboys and oil wells and rodeos and things like that. And certainly that is very Texas. But Texas is also home to the fourth largest city in the United States, which is Houston. We have about 4 million people in the greater Houston metropolitan area, and the greater Houston area region has about 54 different school districts that have more than 1 million children. And so we're pretty big, and we have had some pretty big things happening to us that I'll be talking about in just a moment. But before I do that, wanted to let you know just briefly about what our Center for School Behavioral Health at Mental Health America of Greater Houston is all about. It was actually created in the 2012-2013 school year when we had school districts come to us expressing total dismay at the number of students that were presenting in the schools that had serious mental health issues. And they were just overwhelmed, and they had never had so many students, and they'd never had so many students that had so many serious mental health issues. So we decided to partner with our area school districts and our area child serving organizations to get together to form an initiative to look into what was really happening, why are these issues happening with our students, and what can we do to help. And out of that, 37 consensus recommendations were agreed upon to improve the prevention, early identification, and intervention and treatment of behavioral health issues among students. And in 2016, we received funding to be able to bring this, what was at that time before an initiative, to become a center. And what you see in front of you, we call it our Parthenon, kind of talks about the different areas in which we work to bring together our community around this area, this issue of school behavioral health. We do that in a number of ways by having large meetings where we actually help school districts be able to meet the providers in the community so they can form partnerships. We have learning communities, a lot of professional development, a lot of stigma reduction around the area, around the issue of mental health. We have a wonderful annual conference where Dr. Wong was our keynote speaker for our first conference. And we also do a lot of advocacy and public policy analysis. Next slide, please. So you heard a lot from Pamela and Dr. Wong about trauma in general. And I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma when it comes to natural disasters. It's kind of a community trauma. And as you already heard, so many of our children already experience trauma on a daily basis, but then you have a big event like Hurricane Harvey that just happened to us in August of this year, and it has an enormous impact on the entire city of Houston. These are actual pictures from, some of the scenes that happened during that time. I'm sure many of you saw that in the news. And all of you who sent money to Houston, we're so grateful. And I'll tell you just a little bit about how your money is being used to help us recover from this event. Next slide, please. This trauma actually affected almost 1/3 of the 4 million Houstonians, so about at least 1 million people, or at least I believe 1 million FEMA applications were made. So many people lost their homes, and around almost 1 million children were affected. Even if a child's home was not flooded and they didn't have to be evacuated, the children were affected because we were 5 days with intensive rain falling, and everybody was up 24/7 watching the water rise and wondering if it was going to come into our house or our place of where we lived. And so no matter where you were, if it didn't happen to you that you weren't flooded, you were still traumatized by the event. And you were also traumatized by watching constantly on the television, if you still had power during the event, of people who were being airlifted and boated out of their flooded homes, among other things. The picture you see on the left of your screen, where it shows the stop sign and the intersection of the two streets, that is actually a mile from the home that I grew up in. And that was very upsetting to see that the neighborhood that I grew up in was pretty much destroyed. And you see the picture on the bottom screen of your right. One of the most beautiful things about this event is how the community came together, regardless of everybody was hit, regardless of their income level, where they lived. One way or another, everybody was touched by it, and then there was so much community response for those who were able to get out and help others. It was really a very meaningful experience to live through. Next slide, please. So we were very quickly called into action or propelled into action because of our role in the community as the Center for School Behavioral Health. What are we going to do? The first things that we did is we gathered all the resources that we possibly could, posted them up on our website so that people could immediately get help from our website if we weren't able to touch them personally at that particular time. We were very, very fortunate that a City of Houston mayor's office and our director of education within that office had connections with UNICEF, who came to Houston and met with us days after the rain let up. This was really hard. I'm a native Houstonian, and I'm kind of old, and I've lived here most of my life, but it was really, really hard to consider the fact that an international children's aid organization that in your mind is connotated with third world countries, helping third world countries, was in my backyard. And when I finally realized they're here because we are like a third world country right now, this big amazing city is kind of brought to its knees by all this water. And we are so grateful that UNICEF helped us along with the City of Houston to develop how we're going to help our community recover from this trauma, especially our students. Next slide, please. So what we developed were several strategies. The first one, training and trauma-informed classroom strategies. I will tell you about in just a moment. But what we did with that is we worked, well, I'll go ahead and tell you right now. We worked to identify schools that were hardest hit, and then we reached out to them and we said, we can help you to help the rest of the people in your school by training a couple of facilitators from your campus who you in turn can teach about what trauma is, how it affects students, what kind of behaviors are manifest in the classroom, and how you can empower everybody on campus, especially the classroom teachers, with strategies for helping them to deal with the behavior they see. One of the things that was also very challenging at this time is so many of our teachers and other support staff in schools were also traumatized because they lost their homes also. So we had to be very sensitive in the way that we designed that training. And again, I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. The next part of that was working with the Trauma and Grief Center through Texas Children's Hospital here in Houston that is set up as one of the child traumatic stress national centers to actually help students that are experiencing trauma. And so we enlisted their help and also the help of Save the Children to develop interventions for students that would be struggling, not only initially, but for the long haul. As many of you know, that trauma doesn't always show up right away, and it can last up to 18 months, up to 3 years, et cetera. The effects can be very acute for that period of time. So we have therapeutic group settings that are, we trained a lot of clinicians to be able to run these, what we call also psychosocial education groups. And so those were started also later on in the school year. And we also were very fortunate that Kognito offered to help us roll out their mental health at-risk simulation to all the school districts that were involved in our collaborative. And so that was 26 school districts at the time. And they were able to access that information if they weren't able to get the face-to-face training. Any educator, any school bus driver, any cafeteria worker, anybody associated with the school could log on and get the 1 hour at-risk simulation. we are also very excited to announce that also through UNICEF and the City of Houston, we just recently became aware that UNICEF was able to fund the development of specific trauma-informed modules that will be inside of the at-risk Kognito mental health simulations. And so I know Jennifer will probably want to tell you more about that later, but we're very, very excited because those will come at a time, actually in August, they'll be ready to roll out, and that will be around the 1-year anniversary of Harvey. And so we're anticipating that many of our students and teachers will begin to be experiencing, again, the long-term effects of trauma at that time. Next slide, please. So one of the things we did in the training, which was very short, because we knew that the one thing that happened is that teachers were not able to teach for a minimum of 2 weeks. All of our schools were closed for about 2 weeks because so many of the campuses flooded. And it's amazing how our school districts were able to pull together and figure out how to manage that problem alone, much less getting school up and running within 2 weeks after so many flooded campuses. But there was a lot of stress involved with that, and we knew that because they were 2 weeks behind, because our state does have a test that all students are expected to take, regardless of what they've experienced trauma-wise, even in an event like this in the springtime of the year, that our teachers would be very stressed in trying to teach as quickly as they can to catch up the students, and would not be too much interested in spending a day or two learning how to have trauma-informed classroom strategies. So we distilled it all very quickly. We ended up the training on trauma. The first part of the training that we developed was only supposed to be 45 minutes delivered to the teachers on campus. The people who went through to get the training to be facilitators had about a 4-hour training, but the actual delivery is a 45-minute for the trauma part. And here you see something that was included in there, some very simple strategies that we gave to the teachers. We asked the teachers to share the strategies that they felt were trauma informed, and they came up with wonderful ideas to share with each other. And we started out the sessions by asking the teachers how they're doing, how are they feeling, which was so important because the teachers need the opportunity to share how they're feeling before they can relax and listen and learn from the information we were sharing with them. Many of them, of course, initially and to this day are feeling overwhelmed, stressed, defeated. And so we are very mindful of how important this information is, not only for them to learn about for their students, but also for themselves. Next slide, please. And that's why we also had a second part of our trauma training for our teachers. And I'll come back to that slide. So you can go ahead to the next slide, please. We had another part, which was mindfulness. We worked with one of our leading experts in mindfulness, Dr. Ann Friedman, to develop a training module also for our teachers. And you can go to the final slide then. That mindfulness, many of you are probably familiar with it, but it's really, as the definition says there, it's really helping to train your mind to kind of weed out all the noise in your mind and just be aware and attuned to the here and now, and to also practice certain strategies such as taking 3 deep breaths and an additional number of strategies that you can do to help calm your brain, calm your body. We found in our evaluations of our training, the teachers appreciated most understanding, of course, trauma's effects on the brains and why what looks like, for example, hyperactivity is most likely going to be trauma from trauma effects from a great number of students. And so understanding that, understanding ways that they can help the students in the classroom. And then the mindfulness was tremendous also, because the mindfulness can help the teachers to calm themselves, and also how they can teach these strategies to their students to help calm their students as well. The slide that I asked Jennifer to go through pretty quickly, that wish my teacher knew, that was another strategy that we shared with them. This came from a teacher by the name of Kyle Schwartz, who gave her students a prompt one day saying, tell me, one thing you wish I knew. I wish my teacher knew. And she got, you would think the kids would say things like, of my favorite color is blue, or wish I knew that my mommy's going to have another baby, or something like that. But what she got a lot of was, I wish my teacher knew that we live in a car. I wish my teacher knew that my uncle is touching me in ways that make me feel uncomfortable. I wish my teacher knew that we don't have enough food to eat. My dad's in jail. All these kind of things. And we felt that that would be a wonderful activity to help our teachers know a little bit better about what's happening with their students. And we encouraged our teachers to do this activity with their students on a regular basis, perhaps once a month, kind of like a way of checking in with the students to see how they're doing, and whatever the students choose to tell them. We just had one teacher who submitted the information to us from this activity, and one of the students wrote, I wish my teacher knew that I'm having a lot of thoughts and I think I want to kill myself. And so, again, the student may never have expressed that without having this activity. So that's in a nutshell some of the work that we're doing here in the greater Houston area to respond to Harvey. But one of the things we had tried to do before the storm was ever even forming in the Gulf was to get trauma training and trauma as a mandate for all of our educators to have every year. It did not pass in our legislature in the spring of 2017, and so we are hoping that all of the efforts, and again, so many of you who I mentioned sent us money to help us, we are hoping to the community is using the money in so many wonderful ways to help all of our citizens and all of our children. And one of the ways we hope to also help is to educate our legislators again how important it is that not only for our teachers but for our students, our entire communities, to be trauma informed so that we can have happier and healthier lives. So thank you so much again for the opportunity to share with you our experience in Houston.
Thank you, Janet and Pamela, and I hope you'll both stay on the line. We have a lot of questions, and while we're getting ourselves organized to answer those questions and to pose them to the two of you, we do have a poll question for everybody on the phone. If you don't mind, please tell us to what extent your school or district is using trauma-informed practices today. And that would be from 1 on the low end to 5 on the high end. We would love to hear from you. Obviously, you're here because you care about this topic or you want to learn more. So that's coming in. And while that's coming in, Janet, I'm going to send the first question over to you.
Okay.
And that is I guess actually for both of you, Pamela and Janet, how can we best educate administrators and school staff about the need for trauma-informed practices?
Well, I'll just go real briefly and then turn it over to Pamela. I think that what's in it for me is really important. I feel that if we can convince leadership that if they they become a trauma-informed campus, that they will see less disruptive behavior. They'll see better attendance. They'll see greater academic success. And I think that that's the most important thing, bottom line, to educators. So and we have the evidence to show that now. So that's how I would approach that.
Pamela, do you want to add to that?
I couldn't agree more that, what we call mission alignment, and we have for so long had the silos of the academic mission of schools and then sprinkling in some sort of behavioral or mental health, and to align the two missions of those two silos and to say that by enhancing the wellness of our students, we're going to see improvement in those academic aims is absolutely the way to approach administrators. And I would also say that they, it's hard to get everyone in a room, and I think there's different ways to be resourceful, whether it's a one pager for those schools that have the opportunity to do an in-service. Those can be really beneficial. And then finally, I know what has been most powerful in some of the presentations that I've done is really just showing the new science that's coming out around the neurological impact of trauma on students and how those neurological adaptations really translate into academic performance and social emotional functioning. That's been quite powerful in the presentations that I've had the opportunity to give.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. And let's share our poll results and see how people are feeling about the degree to which their schools are trauma informed. And it looks like there's quite a bit of headroom to do better. 15% said very low, 31% is somewhat low, 41% was sort of somewhere in the middle, 12% sort of on the high side, and 1% on the very high. So I think that the SHAPE system and all the evaluation tools that you shared, Pamela, will be really helpful to folks on the phone, because I understand that will give them a kind of typology for where they are and what they can do better. Can you just repeat where they go to get that information?
Have the flyer that you can distribute with all of the slides, but it's the SHAPE system. It's theshapesystem.com. And
okay,
that's a platform
great.
housed by the Center for School Mental Health, and our trauma responsive school implementation assessment is one of the many assessments available on that platform. And I did want to say, just in reaction to that poll result, that I actually think it's quite promising that you have that 40% saying that they're doing pretty well. And one of the aims of the way we constructed our assessment was we didn't want schools to feel like when they're trying to become a trauma-informed system that we're recreating the wheel. And one of our missions was to say, there's probably a number of things that you're already doing that are trauma-informed, but you may not be doing it yet with a lens that is trauma-informed. And so I think the fact that there are likely a lot of things that schools are already doing, and we want schools to get the credit for that. And then, of course, find opportunities and find places where there's gaps and enhance from there.
That's a great point, and I think anybody who's doing PBIS and RTI and MTSS work will see that it's sort of a 90-degree shift in how you're looking at the system, but there are a lot of the elements there. I think that's my takeaway. And Janet, I think you work with so many 30 school districts, more than 30 school districts in Houston. Can you talk a little bit about that? You talked about convincing school districts that a focus on trauma is going to result in better attendance and better academic success. Who do you see as the key decision makers and stakeholders who need to get that message and be those leaders? Is that the school board? Is that the superintendent?
Well, I would think all of the above, but it's harder to get to that high level. But so we work more with like the administrators, high-level administrators, and this psychological services, the counseling departments, the special ed departments. And then there's also, I don't want to underestimate the power of parents and other concerned advocates. So often parents who have had children who are not getting their mental health needs met raise their voices in very, very productive ways. And so we have quite a few parent advocates that are part of our collaborative that we're very grateful for, that have made tremendous inroads. In fact, one of our parent advocates went with us to our state capitol to advocate for the law that we got passed in 2013 that mandated all educators receive training in mental health signs and symptoms related to students in distress and how to help them. And without her testimony, I doubt that it would have passed.
That's great. A question for you, Pamela. I would say, I think when we looked at it, the majority of people who are registered today have the role of school counselor. What is the special role of the school counselor in responding to trauma within the school?
Well, I think one of the roles can be being that change agent and being that voice. But I think the school counselor is also the person where there's a lot of connections being made. And so you have teachers who may not be able to fully articulate what's going on with a student, but the counselor is then able to frame it for the teacher in a way that maybe enhances some understanding. So I think that the counselor can be the person who's starting to disseminate that shared language and that shared understanding of the impact of trauma on students. Of course, additionally, serving in the role of providing treatment and early intervention to students that's within their mission, but being that change agent and being that person to disseminate this shared vision, I think, is critically important.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let me do a quick time check. We have 4 minutes. So I do want to do a last poll. The polling question is, yes or no, I am currently advocating in my school or district for the use of trauma-informed practices. That looks like a very engaged and positive group. And before we let you go today, I just want to thank both of our, or all of our panelists, Marlene Wong, Pamela Vona, and Janet Pasmentier. And thank you from Kognito for attending this session. For those of you who don't know our work, we're a leader in health simulations. Some of you know us from our webinar series, but our core work is in developing and deploying evidence-based role-play simulations that let you practice talking with virtual students to improve well-being, academic performance, and attendance. So please contact us for a free demo. We can send you a demo of the mental health simulations that are currently being used by Janet and the districts at the school-based Behavioral Health Collaborative, or in the or our new simulations that will incorporate a lot of trauma-informed practice instruction. So I want to publish our poll. 80% of you say that you are currently advocating in your school and district for the use of trauma-informed practices. And I think Marlene would be particularly delighted to hear that as she began this session by saying this is the public health issue of our time. So thanks to both of you, Janet and Pamela, for staying through to the bitter end. Thank you for everybody on the phone for taking the time and all that you do to support children in your work. Thanks very much.